Chapter 6 of The Angel of the Revolution by George Griffith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6 New Friends. As Arnold returned the greeting of the President, all the other members of the circle rose from their seats and took off their masks and the black shapeless cloaks which had so far completely covered them from head to foot. Then, one after the other, they came forward and were formally introduced to him by the President. 9 of the 14 were men and 5 were women, of ages varying from middle age almost to girlhood. The men were apparently all between 25 and 35, and included some half-dozen nationalities among them. All, both men and women, evidently belonged to the educated, or rather, to the cultured class. Their speech, which seemed to change with perfect ease from one language to another in the course of their somewhat polyglot converse, was the easy-flowing speech of men and women accustomed to the best society, not only in the social but the intellectual sense of the word. All were keen, alert, and swift of thought, and on the face of each one there was the dignifying expression of a deep and settled purpose, which at once differentiated them in Arnold's eyes from the ordinary idle or merely money-making citizens of the world. As each one came and shook hands with the new member of the Brotherhood, he or she had some pleasant word of welcome and greeting for him, and so well were the words chosen, and so manifestly sincere were they spoken, that by the time he had shaken hands all round, Arnold felt as much at home among them as though he were in the midst of a circle of old friends. Among the women were 2 who had attracted his attention and roused his interest far more than any of the other members of the circle. One of these was a tall and beautifully shaped woman, whose face and figure were those of a woman in the early 20s, but whose long, thick hair was as white as though the snows of 70 winters had drifted over it. As he returned her warm, firm hand-clasp, and looked upon her dark, resolute, and yet perfectly womanly figures, the young engineer gave a slight start of recognition. She noticed this at once, and said, with a smile and a quick flash from her splendid grey eyes, "Ah, I see you recognize me. No, I am not ashamed of my portrait. I am proud of the wounds that I received in the war with tyranny, so you need not fear to confess your recognition." It was true that Arnold had recognized her. She was the original of the central figure of the painting which depicted the woman being flogged by the Russian soldiers. Arnold flushed hotly at the words with the sudden passionate anger that they roused within him, and replied, in a low, steady voice, "Those who would sanction such a crime as that are not fit to live. I will not leave one stone of that prison standing upon another. It is a blot on the face of the earth, and I will wipe it out utterly." "There are thousands of blots as black as that on the earth, and I think you will find nobler game than an obscure Russian provincial prison. Russia has cities and palaces and fortresses that will make far grander ruins than that, ruins that will be worthy monuments of fallen despotism," replied the girl who had been introduced by the President as Radna Michaelis. "But here is someone else waiting to make your acquaintance. This is Natasha. She has no other name among us, but you will soon learn why she needs none." Natasha was the other woman who had so keenly aroused Arnold's interest. Woman, however, she hardly was, for she was seemingly still in her teens, and certainly could not have been more than 20. He had mixed but little with women, and during the past few years not at all, and therefore the marvellous beauty of the girl who came forward as Radna spoke seemed almost unearthly to him, and confused his senses for the moment as some potent drug might have done. He took her outstretched hand in awkward silence, and for an instant so far forgot himself as to gaze blankly at her in speechless admiration. She could not help noticing it, for she was a woman, and for the same reason she saw that it was so absolutely honest and involuntary that it was impossible for any woman to take offence at it. A quick, bright flush swept up her lovely face as his hand closed upon hers. Her darkly fringed lids fell for an instant over the most wonderful pair of sapphire blue eyes that Arnold had ever dreamed of, and when she raised them again the flush had gone, and she said, in a sweet, frank voice, I am the daughter of Natas, and he has desired me to bid you welcome in his name, and I hope you will let me do so in my own as well. We are all dying to see this wonderful invention of yours. I suppose you are going to satisfy our feminine curiosity, are you not?" The daughter of Natas? This lovely girl, in the first sweet flush of her pure and innocent womanhood, the daughter of the unknown and mysterious being whose ill-omened name caused a shudder if it was only whispered in the homes of the rich and powerful, the name with which the death sentences of the terrorists were invariably signed, and which had come to be an infallible guarantee that they would be carried out to the letter. No death warrants of the most powerful sovereigns of Europe were more certain harbingers of inevitable doom than were those which bore this dreaded name. Whether he were high or low, the man who received one of them made ready for his end. He knew not where or when the fatal blow would be struck. He only knew that the invisible hand of the terror would strike him as surely in the uttermost ends of the earth as it would in the palace or the fortress. Never once had it missed its aim, and never once had the slightest clue been obtained to the identity of the hand that held the knife or pistol. Some such thoughts as these flashed one after another through Arnold's brain as he stood talking with Natasha. He saw at once why she had only that one name. It was enough, and it was not long before he learned that it was the symbol of an authority in the circle that admitted of no question. She was the envoy of him whose word was law, absolute and irrevocable to every member of the Brotherhood, to disobey whom was death, and to obey whom had, so far at least, meant swift and invariable success, even where it seemed least to be hoped for. Of course, Natasha's almost girlish question about the airship was really a command, which would have been none the less binding had she only had her own beauty to enforce it. As she spoke, the President and Colston, who had only lost himself for the time behind a mask and a cloak, came up to Arnold and asked him if he was prepared to give an exhibition of the powers of his model and to explain its working and construction to the circle at once. He replied that everything was perfectly ready for the trial, and that he would set the model working for them in a few minutes. The President then told him that the exhibition should take place in another room where there would be much more space than where they were, and bade him bring the box and follow him. A door was now opened in the wall of the room, remote from that by which he and Colston had entered, and through this the whole party went down a short passage, and through another door at the end of which opened into a very large apartment, which, from the fact of its being windowless, Arnold rightly judged to be underground like the council chamber that they had just left. A single glance was enough to show him the chief purpose to which the chamber was devoted. The wall at one end was covered with arm racks containing all the newest and most perfect makes of rifles and pistols, while at the other end, about 20 paces distant, were 3 electric signalling targets, graded, as was afterwards explained to him, to 1, 3 and 500 yards range. In a word, the chamber was an underground range for rifle and pistol practice, in which a volley could have been fired without a sound being heard 10 yards away. It was here that the accuracy of the various weapons invented from time to time was tested, and here too every member of the circle, man and woman, practised with rifle and pistol until an infallible aim was acquired. A register of scores was kept, and at the head of it stood the name of Radna Michaelis. A long table ran across the end at which the arm racks were, and on this Arnold laid the case containing the model, he standing on one side of the table and the members of the circle on the other, watching his movements with a curiosity that they took no trouble to disguise. He opened the case, feeling something like a scientific demonstrator with an advanced and critical class before him. In a moment the man disappeared, and the mechanician and the enthusiast took his place. As each part was taken out and laid upon the table, he briefly explained its use, and then, last of all, came the hull of the airship. This was 3 feet long and 6 inches broad in its midships diameter. It was made in 2 longitudinal sections of polished aluminium, which shone like burnished silver. It would have been cigar-shaped but for the fact that the forward end was drawn out into a long sharp ram, the point of which was on a level with the floor of the hull amidships as it lay upon the table. Two deep bilge plates running nearly the whole length of the hull kept it in an upright position and prevented the blades of the propellers from touching the table. For about half its whole length, the upper part of the hull was flattened and formed a deck from which rose three short, strong masts, each of which carried a wheel of thin metal, whose spokes were 6 inclined fans, something like the blades of a screw. A little lower than this deck there projected on each side a broad, oblong, slightly curved sheet of metal, very thin but strengthened by means of wire braces till it was as rigid as a plate of solid steel, although it only weighed a few ounces. These air planes worked on an axis amidships and could be inclined either way through an angle of 30 degrees. At the pointed stern there revolved a powerful 4-bladed propeller, and from each quarter, inclined slightly outwards from the middle line of the vessel, projected a somewhat smaller screw working underneath the aft end of the air planes. The hull contained 4 small double-cylinder engines, one of which actuated the stern propeller, and the other 3 the fan wheels and side propellers. There were, of course, no furnaces, boilers, or condensers. 2 slender pipes ran into each cylinder from suitably placed gas reservoirs, or power cylinders as the engineer called them, and that was all. Arnold deftly and rapidly put the parts together, continuing his running description as he did so, and in a few minutes the beautiful miracle of ingenuity stood complete before the wondering eyes of the circle, and a murmur of admiration ran from lip to lip, bringing a flush of pleasure to the cheek of its creator. "There," said he as he put the finishing touches to the apparatus, "you see that she is a combination of 2 principles, those of the aeronef and the aeroplane. The first reached its highest development in Jules Verne's imaginary Clipper of the Clouds, and the second in Hiram Maxim's aeroplane. Of course, Jules Verne's aeronef was merely an idea, and one that could never be realised, while Rober's mysterious source of electrical energy remained unknown, as it still does. Maxim's aeroplane is, as you all know, also an unrealised ideal, so far as any practical use is concerned. He has succeeded in making it fly, but only under the most favourable conditions, and practically without cargo. Its 2 fatal defects have been shown by experience to be comparatively overwhelming weight of the engine and the fuel that he has to carry to develop sufficient power to rise from the ground and progress against the wind, and the inability of the machine to ascend perpendicularly to any required height. Without the power to do this, no airship can be any use save under very limited conditions. You cannot carry a railway about with you, or a station to get a start from every time you want to rise, and you cannot always choose a nice level plane in which to come down. Even if you could, the aeroplane would not rise again without its rails and carriage. For purposes of warfare, then, it may be dismissed as totally useless. In this machine, as you see, I have combined the 2 principles. These helices on the masts will lift the dead weight of the ship perpendicularly without the slightest help from the side planes, which are used to regulate the vessel's flight when afloat. I will set the engines that work them in motion independently of the others which move the propellers, and then you'll see what I mean." As he spoke, he set one part of the mechanism working. Those watching saw the 3 helices begin to spin round, the centre one revolving in an opposite direction to the other 2, with a soft whirring sound that gradually rose to a high-pitched note. When they attained their full speed, they looked like solid wheels, and then the airship rose, at first slowly, and then more and more swiftly, straight up from the table, until it strained hard at the piece of cord which prevented it from reaching the roof. A universal chorus of "Bravos!" greeted it as it rose, and every eye became fixed on it as it hung motionless in the air, sustained by its whirring helices. After letting it remain aloft for a few minutes, Arnold pulled it down again, saying as he did so, "That, I think, proves that the machine can rise from any position where the upward road is open, and without the slightest assistance of any apparatus. Now it shall take a voyage around the room. You see it is steered by this rudder fan under the stern propeller. In the real ship it will be worked by a wheel, like a rudder of a sea-going vessel, but in the model it is done by this lever, so that I can control it by a couple of strings from the ground." He went round to the other side of the table while he was speaking, and adjusted the steering gear, stopping the engines meanwhile. Then he put the model down on the floor, set all 4 engines to work, and stood behind with the guiding strings in his hands. The spectators heard a louder and somewhat shriller whirring noise than before, and the beautiful fabric with its shining silvery hull and side planes rose slantingly from the ground and darted forward down the room, keeping Arnold at a quick run with the rudder strings tightly strained. Like an obedient steed, it instantly obeyed the slightest pull upon either of them, and twice made the circuit of the room before its creator pulled it down and stopped the machinery. The experiment was a perfect and undeniable success in every respect, and not one of those who saw it had the slightest doubt as to Arnold's airship having at last solved the problem of aerial navigation, and made the Brotherhood lords of a realm as wide as the atmospheric ocean that encircles the globe. As soon as the model was once more resting on the table, the President came forward, and grasping the engineer by both hands, said in a voice from which he made but little effort to banish the emotion that he felt, "Bravo, brother! Henceforth you shall be known to the Brotherhood as the Master of the Air, for truly you have been the first among the sons of men to fairly conquer it. Come, let us go back and talk, for there is much to be said about this, and we cannot begin too soon to make arrangements for building the first of our aerial fleet. You can leave your model where it is in perfect safety, for no one ever enters this room save ourselves." So saying, the President led the way to the council chamber, and there, after the Ariel, as it had already been decided to name the first airship, had been christened in anticipation in 20-year-old champagne, the circle settled down at once to business, and for a good 3 hours discussed the engineer's estimate and plans for building the first vessel of the aerial fleet. At length the practical details were settled, and the President rose in token of the end of the conference. As he did so, he said somewhat abruptly to Arnold, "So far, so good. Now, there is nothing more to be done but to lay those plans before the Chief and get his authority for withdrawing out of the Treasury sufficient money to commence operations. I presume you could reproduce them from memory if necessary, at any rate in sufficient outline to make them perfectly intelligible?" "Certainly," was the reply. "I could reproduce them in facsimile without the slightest difficulty. Why do you ask?" "Because the Chief is in Russia, and you must go to him and place them before him from memory. They are far too precious to be trusted to any keeping, however trustworthy. There are such things as railway accidents and other forms of sudden death, to say nothing of the Russian customs, false arrests, personal searches, and imprisonments on mere suspicion. We can risk none of these, and so there is nothing for it but your going to Petersburg and verbally explaining them to the Chief. You can be ready in 3 days, I suppose?" "Yes, in 2 if you like," replied Arnold, not a little taken aback at the unexpected suddenness of what he knew at once to be the first order that was to test his obedience to the Brotherhood. "But as I am absolutely ignorant of Russia and the Russians, I suppose you will make such arrangements as will prevent my making any innocent but possibly awkward mistakes?" "Oh yes," replied the President with a smile. "All arrangements have been made already, and I expect you will find them anything but unpleasant. Natasha goes to Petersburg in company with another lady member of the circle whom you have not yet seen. You will go with them, and they will explain everything to you en route, if they have no opportunity of doing so before you start. Now, let us go upstairs and have some supper. I am famished, and I suppose everyone else is too." Arnold simply bowed in answer to the President, but one pair of eyes at least in the room caught the quick faint flush that rose in his cheek as he was told in whose company he was to travel. As for himself, if the journey had been to Siberia instead of Russia, he would have felt nothing but pleasure at the prospect after that. They left the council chamber by the passage and the ante-room, the sentry standing to attention as they passed him, each giving the word in turn till the President came last and closed the doors behind him. Then the sentry brought up the rear and extinguished the lights as he left the passage. 15 minutes later there sat down to supper in the solidly comfortable dining room of the upper house a party of ladies and gentlemen who chatted through the meal as merrily and innocently as though there were no such things as tyranny or suffering in the world, and whom not the most acute observer would have taken for the most dangerous and desperately earnest body of conspirators that ever plotted the destruction, not of an empire, but of a civilization and a social order that it had taken 20 centuries to build up. End of chapter 6.